The rain hammered against the car windshield, turning the streets into glistening rivers of light. Inside his luxury sedan, Alexander Grayson barely noticed the storm. His mind was locked onto his upcoming business presentation, the deal that could push his company into an even higher league. Every minute of his life was measured, every decision calculated. Emotions? They had no place in his world. But that night, something shattered his usual rhythm. At a red light, his eyes flicked to the sidewalk. A woman stood hunched against the cold, her arms wrapped tightly around a baby. She wasn't just shielding the child from the rain. She was protecting it as if the world itself was trying to take it away from her. Her soaked coat clung to her frail frame, her hands trembling as she clutched a cardboard sign. The words, written in uneven strokes, hit him harder than he expected. "Please help. We need food and shelter." Alexander exhaled sharply, shifting his gaze back to the road. He had seen people like her before, countless times. He knew better than to get involved. Yet, as the light turned green, he found himself unable to press the accelerator. His fingers tightened around the steering wheel. He could leave. He should leave. But something about the desperation in her eyes, the way she held the baby as if it was the only thing left in the world that mattered, made it impossible to look away. The car window slid down. The woman hesitated, her wary eyes meeting his. For a moment, neither spoke. Rain dripped from her hair, blending with the tears she wasn't even aware she was shedding. The baby stirred against her chest, too exhausted to cry. "Get in," Alexander said. His own voice surprised him, firm but not unkind. She hesitated. He saw the battle in her eyes. Trusting a stranger was dangerous, but leaving her child out in this storm? That was worse. Finally, she stepped forward. The car door opened, and as she slid inside, Alexander turned the heater up. The warmth wrapped around her, but she still shivered. In the rearview mirror, their eyes met. Hers were hollow, exhausted, but there was something else, something he couldn't quite name. "What's your name?" he asked. "Grace," she murmured. "And this is Lucy." Alexander nodded, saying nothing. The road stretched ahead, leading to the airport. That was where he was supposed to be. Instead, he took a sharp turn in the opposite direction. Grace stiffened. "Where are we going?" "My house," he said simply. And for the first time in years, he didn't think twice about what he was doing. The mansion stood in eerie silence, its towering glass walls reflecting the storm outside. Grace hesitated at the massive entrance, gripping Lucy closer. She had spent nights curled up in alleyways, in shelters that smelled of damp desperation. But this was something out of a dream, or maybe a nightmare. Alexander pushed open the door and stepped aside. "Come in." She swallowed hard, her instinct screaming at her to turn around, but the warmth inside was undeniable. As she stepped in, her soaked shoes left faint prints on the polished marble floor. The air smelled of something expensive, something untouched, like this house had never known real life inside it. Alexander dropped his keys on a nearby table and turned to face her. "You'll stay here tonight. There's food in the kitchen, clothes upstairs." Grace blinked. Just like that. No conditions, no expectations. People didn't do things for free, especially men like him. She hesitated. Why? For a second, something flickered across his face, something almost human. But then it was gone. "Because I can." His answer left her more unsettled than reassured, but exhaustion was stronger than doubt. She glanced down at Lucy, who had fallen into a deep sleep against her chest. The baby's tiny fingers twitched, her breath soft and steady. For the first time in months, she looked safe. Grace exhaled, her grip on reality slipping. Maybe this was all a cruel trick. Maybe in the morning she'd be thrown out like garbage. But for tonight, she would let herself breathe. Alexander turned to leave, but something made him pause at the door. He glanced over his shoulder, his expression unreadable. "Don't touch anything you don't need." And with that, he was gone, leaving Grace standing in the middle of a house that didn't belong to her, holding a baby that was the only real thing she had left. The house swallowed her in silence once Alexander left. Grace stood frozen, the weight of exhaustion pressing against her, but her mind refused to believe this was real. She had spent too many nights fearing what the next day would bring, too many mornings waking up to nothing but hunger and cold. Luxury like this wasn't meant for people like her. She glanced down at Lucy, still asleep in her arms, her tiny chest rising and falling peacefully. A warmth spread through Grace's chest. This was the first time in months her daughter had a real roof over her head. She wasn't shivering in the night air, wasn't stirring from discomfort. That alone was enough to push Grace forward. Her footsteps were hesitant as she wandered into the living room. The space was massive, high ceilings, glass walls, furniture that looked untouched. A crystal chandelier hung above her, its glow casting soft golden shadows. This wasn't just a house, it was a world she didn't belong to. Her stomach twisted painfully. The last thing she had eaten was a leftover sandwich a stranger had tossed toward her that morning. She needed food, but the kitchen, the thought of stepping into it felt wrong, like she was an intruder. But then Lucy stirred against her, letting out a soft whimper, and instinct overpowered fear. Her child came first, always. Grace moved quickly, opening the fridge. It was packed. Meats, cheeses, vegetables so fresh they still held droplets of water on their leaves. It was overwhelming. How could one man have so much while people like her had nothing? Her hands trembled as she reached for a loaf of bread. She pulled out some eggs, unsure if she was even allowed to use them. But when she cracked one into a pan, the sizzle of warm food nearly broke her. She hadn't cooked a real meal in months. The scent of eggs filled the air, and Lucy shifted again, her tiny nose twitching. Grace smiled softly. For one night, at least, her daughter would go to bed with a full stomach. She sat at the kitchen counter, feeding Lucy small bites, watching her baby's eyes light up with joy. And in that moment, she let herself believe, just for a second, that maybe life wasn't done with her yet. The storm outside had quieted, but inside, Grace still felt the weight of uncertainty pressing against her. Lucy had fallen asleep again, her tiny hands clutching the soft fabric of the blanket Grace had found upstairs. She watched her daughter's peaceful face, running a gentle hand over her curls. If only life could stay this simple. Just the two of them, warm, safe, untouched by the world's cruelty. But reality had a way of creeping back in. She moved through the house cautiously, the silence making every step feel too loud. The upstairs hallway stretched endlessly, leading to rooms she could never dream of calling her own. She found one with a large bed, its white sheets perfectly tucked, untouched by time. It felt wrong to sink into something so soft, so clean, but her body ached from months of sleeping on concrete. She hesitated before carefully placing Lucy in the center of the bed, surrounding her with pillows to keep her safe. The baby sighed in her sleep, completely unaware of the miracle they had just stumbled into. Grace, however, couldn't let herself relax. Not yet. She wandered back downstairs, her fingers grazing the expensive wood of the staircase railing. What kind of man offers his home to a stranger and walks away? Wealthy men like Alexander Grayson didn't do charity. They didn't even see people like her. And yet here she was, standing in his world. Why? She reached the living room, pausing at the sight of a framed newspaper article on the wall. It was old, slightly yellowed at the edges, but the name stood out. Alexander Grayson, From Poverty to Power. Her breath caught. He hadn't always been rich. Before she could process the thought, the front door suddenly unlocked. Her heart leaped into her throat as she spun around. Alexander stepped inside, shaking off the cold, his sharp eyes scanning the room. When they landed on her, something flickered in his expression, curiosity, or maybe something darker. "You're still awake," he said, more of an observation than a question. Grace swallowed, forcing herself to stand tall. Couldn't sleep. He held her gaze for a moment before nodding slightly. Then, without another word, he walked past her, disappearing into the house. Just like that, the moment was over. Grace exhaled slowly, gripping the fabric of her borrowed sweater. She didn't trust this situation. But for the first time in a long time, she wasn't running from it either. The night stretched on in uneasy silence. Grace sat at the edge of the bed, watching Lucy sleep, her tiny chest rising and falling in peaceful rhythm. The mansion felt too big, too empty, like a place that had never truly been lived in. The luxury around her was suffocating, a stark contrast to the cold streets she had called home for too long. She didn't belong here. She knew that. But for tonight, she had nowhere else to go. Her mind replayed Alexander's face when he had walked in. There was something unreadable about him, something guarded. He didn't ask if she needed anything. He didn't offer comfort. He simply let her exist in his space. And yet, that alone made him different. No one else had ever offered her anything without expecting something in return. The exhaustion in her body finally won, and she lay down beside Lucy, careful not to disturb her. For the first time in months, she slept without fear. Morning came too quickly. Grace woke to the soft glow of sunlight filtering through the floor-length windows. For a brief moment, she forgot where she was. The bed beneath her was too soft, the room too quiet. But then, reality came rushing back. She was still in Alexander Grayson's house, and she had no idea what would happen next. A faint noise downstairs pulled her from her thoughts. She sat up carefully, glancing at Lucy, who was still asleep. Her daughter's face was calm, free from the tension of hunger and cold. That alone gave Grace the strength to move. She made her way downstairs, her bare feet silent against the polished floors. The house smelled of fresh coffee, and for a second she thought she was alone. But then she saw him. Alexander sat at the kitchen island, a newspaper in his hands, a cup of coffee beside him. He didn't look up as she entered, but she knew he was aware of her presence. Grace hesitated. She should say something, but what? Thank you? I'll leave now. Who was she in his world? Just a guest, or a mistake? Before she could decide, he finally spoke. There's food in the fridge. It wasn't an invitation. It was a statement. Cold, distant, just like him. Grace's fingers tightened slightly. I wasn't expecting breakfast. He finally looked up, his sharp gaze locking onto hers. I wasn't expecting company. The words stung more than they should have. She should have expected them. She was just a stranger he had picked up off the streets. Grace forced herself to keep her expression neutral. I'll be gone soon. For a moment, Alexander didn't respond. His eyes studied her, like he was trying to figure out why he had even brought her here in the first place. Then, he simply said, "Eat first." There was no warmth in his voice, no kindness. But it wasn't cruelty either. It was something else, something she couldn't yet understand. Grace didn't argue. She took a quiet breath and moved toward the fridge, pulling out a few things to prepare a simple breakfast. Alexander returned to his newspaper, his presence heavy despite the silence between them. The clinking of dishes, the soft sizzle of eggs in the pan, these were normal sounds, domestic even. But nothing about this moment felt normal. Not for her. Not for him. She placed a plate in front of Lucy, who had just woken up, her tiny hands rubbing sleep from her eyes. The baby looked at the food, then at Grace, as if waiting for permission. Grace smiled softly, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's face. Go on, sweetheart. Lucy took a bite, her small face lighting up with delight. Grace felt her chest tighten. This was what she wanted for her daughter. A moment of peace. A life where food wasn't a luxury, where warmth wasn't borrowed. But this wasn't their home. It never would be. She turned to Alexander, who had been watching them in quiet contemplation. Their eyes met, and for the first time, there was something there. Not just curiosity, but understanding. He had built his empire from nothing. He knew what it was like to have the world turn its back on you. Grace swallowed hard. It was time. "I appreciate everything you've done," she said, keeping her voice steady. "But we should go." Alexander set his coffee cup down, the smallest of pauses before he spoke. "And where exactly would you go?" The question caught her off guard. She had no answer. There was no home waiting for her, no job, no safety net. Just the same streets, the same struggle. She knew it, and so did he. Still, she lifted her chin. "We'll figure it out." Alexander exhaled slowly, his fingers tapping lightly against the counter. There was a decision forming behind his eyes, one he hadn't expected to make. He had brought her here on impulse, but now, letting her leave felt wrong. "You can stay," he said finally. Grace stiffened. "Why?" He didn't answer right away. Maybe he didn't even know himself. But then his voice was quieter, almost careful. "Because I can." The same words he had said last night. But this time, they meant something different. Grace looked down at Lucy, who had leaned against her, full and content. For the first time in a long time, the future didn't seem like an impossible fight. She met Alexander's gaze one last time, and then with a quiet nod she accepted. She